Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all here this afternoon. My name is Ainsley Newson and I am convener of the Sydney Health Ethics Network, which is hosting this event. Welcome wherever you are, whether you're here in our room or online. In the room, we are on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and this is unceded Aboriginal land. And I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to elders past and present, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who are either here with us today or listening virtually. And I'd also like to acknowledge the tens of thousands of years of caring for country, sharing knowledge that have happened and which we follow. So Sydney Health Ethics is a network in the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney. And we ask and answer critical questions about health and biomedicine and the environment. And we do that using a variety of methods, some of which will be talked about today. We also undertake an extensive teaching program and public engagement of various kinds. And today's discussion around embracing the empirical in practical ethics research is going to be led by my colleague, Dr. Subramani, and I'd now welcome you here to introduce everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ainsley. So hello, everyone. Now it's a Friday afternoon, I know, but still we are going to have fun, I believe. So when I think about my work or the scholars who use quantitative and qualitative research, I think of khichdi. I'm not sure the cultural reference here, everyone gets this, but the reference I'm trying to have this, it's a metaphor which is used in the Indian subcontinent. It's a dish which has a dish made of rice, lentils, and vegetables, and you can mix and match in different textures of vegetables or the layers of certain lentils. So in order to get a comfort and healthy food, that means you need to add layers of different kind of richness comes with, as I said, the lentils or the rice or the vegetables. So the way I see bioethics, especially empirical bioethics or the methodology which we use, is like this. It's have a different layers and textures, and I see as it's my secret way to make sure you, whenever you think of empirical bioethics, you think of khichdi, right? So I'm sure as applied ethicists, our epistemic normativity are in large part generated out of commitments to political programs of social justice. So while bringing this workshop together with Mikey and John and all the panelists here, I was hoping that this workshop would unpack and maybe even overturn the entire conceptual order in which some conceptual binaries can be taught, and that work may begin by catching at each concept, that is, that when we think of practice and a binary opposition or not at all. So the way I'm hoping is that today's conversation encourages the breakdown of all the binaries, fact and value, is an art, theory and practice, or mind and body. So that's a question which I want to think through, and hopefully this panel conversation and Mikey's conversation, which leads us this way. So let's get started with the today's agenda, of course, having all this to contextualize. To introduce formally Mikey Dunn, Associate Professor and Co-Director of Education at the Center for Biomedical Ethics in the Yong, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it well, Yong Lin School of Medicine at NUS. He works across healthcare ethics, social legal studies, and health services research. His current research interests focus predominantly on the ethical aspects of home and community-based care practice, and he has so many tons of literature and papers, publications around empirical bioethics and also around his research interests. So, well, personally, I got in touch with Mikey through cold email, which I'm very good at, I think. But I did it during my early PhD time. And then I have been on and off in conversations with him. And we had a reflexivity workshop, online workshop at Zurich. And that conversation led to having Abel reflexivity converse, which we had with John and Jackie Lee Scully. And of course, I feel we have to continue this conversation. And this workshop is in a way of that. So, can I say also that John and Mikey will be celebrating 20 years of working together soon, I think. And so the plan is, the format is that Mikey first would give a talk for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we have a Q&A. And then we have a short break, and then we have a panel conversation, which unpacks. And then we have a literature, which I think all of you are aware of, and let's closely engage with those. And then John's plan is, because the format I did not know John was coming here, is John would heckle Mikey, he has promised. So let's see that. So Mikey, what to you?
Well, thank you very much, Supriya, Ainsley, for the invitation, and to all the colleagues from Sydney and beyond for joining. It's really nice to start with food. My mother makes an anglicised version of this dish we call kedgeree, and it's full of smoked haddock, which seems like a real kind of violation of the principle. I love it. So that's a great way to start. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here, especially after 4 days in Brisbane, where I'm sure we're all utterly sick of fraternising with bioethicists. But here we are with one last attempt at socialising and networking and getting to know each other. And what better topic to do that with than empirical bioethics and the nature of the field? So, a couple of provisos, I guess, before I start. I'm just trying to work out how to do this. I can't see my own screen.
Yeah.
You can see it up here, but not on here. Is
that
possible? Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much. That's great. A couple of provisos. One is this is going to be an unashamed 3 hours of navel gazing. We're going to be thinking about what it means to do the work that we do, reflecting on that, critiquing each other, definitely critiquing me, certainly Supriya. They're going to find my work way too conservative, I think, for what her aims of this session are going to be, but I hope that's okay. I also think that it's an opportunity for us to build on some of the stuff that I've written and John's written before. I know that some of the papers were shared beforehand. In my presentation, I'll review some of the basic considerations that I take for granted or advanced thinking around in empirical bioethics, and also update some of those papers with some more recent thinking as well. I hope people will find interesting. I'm really looking forward to the debate. That's going to be fantastic. I think we've got like 90 minutes to talk together, which is brilliant. I've got 45 minutes planned, Supriya. I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Fantastic. So I'll make a start, and I'll kind of talk through a huge number of points that I want to cover in a very short amount of time. Let me use this. Okay, good. This is kind of basic stuff. There's a common starting point that many people here will have complete understanding of. And try and move
you just cross my
yeah.
Sorry.
There we go. Good. So, we all know about the empirical turn. It's been well described, Samuel Hirst onwards. This idea that there's been a development in the field towards an increasing featuring of empirical study, particularly qualitative social science, in bioethics at the expense of more purely philosophical approaches. And we see that in the way in which publications go. We see that in the way in which conferences go. We see that in the way in which the kind of backgrounds of the people who work in the field have taken shape over the years, I think. I think it's fair to say that empirical bioethics is now very well recognized as a kind of core methodological subfield. We can talk coherently about it in those terms. And I think we can think about it as having come to age, that we will understand journals devoted to it. We will see panels that pick it up and people who just do it in their day-to-day practice. That's part of what we're doing in the field. And as we've developed that line or lineage of inquiry, an increasing amount of attention paid to precisely what on earth it's trying to achieve. In particular, and this is the focus for today, how we connect the empirical with the normative. Or perhaps more ambitiously, how we want to integrate the empirical and the normative in the studies that we do. I do think it's fair to say that there's much uncertainty that remains about these questions. That these are not settled matters. People have different views about it. I'll express my own. We'll hear other views later. But the boundaries of what counts as empirical bioethics, the rationales for its methodological approaches differ. People have tried to typologize this subfield, but I don't think that's particularly helped much of the time. It certainly hasn't helped in the everyday conduct of inquiry, I don't think. Many of those typologies, I think, muddy rather than clarify matters for scholars who are perhaps new to the field, certainly. But more broadly, I think there are remaining questions about how we even use this term to describe the work that we do or the work that others do. certainly something that John and I have picked up from the empirical bioethics tradition in Europe, is what we mean by empirical bioethics differs completely from what the Americans mean in their scholarly inquiries. And I'm slowly learning differences between the Australasian, Southeast Asian setup and perhaps the European tradition that I'm more familiar with. Also, I think the precise relationship between the empirical and the ethics is disputed. So what we mean by this entire term, empirical bioethics, captures a whole range of different assumptions, with people preferring other kinds of terms, perhaps to qualify the mode of EB that we're doing. So you might hear people talk about deliberative empirical bioethics, or integrated empirical bioethics, or dialogical empirical bioethics, or so on, which indicates a kind of schism or disagreement, I think, behind the scenes about precisely how we make sense of things that are being done. And you also see people wanting to fall back on their disciplinary identities when giving an account of themselves in this way. So you might say, I'm an empirical bioethicist who comes from this from a social research perspective. I'm an empirical bioethicist who comes from a more philosophical mindset, perhaps. So this kind of disciplinary, I think, backstop is a way of perhaps people not quite being clear about who they're going to meet, how they're going to talk to each other, and understand their positionality in these debates. Where I want to get to. That was a typo, sorry about that. So, in my view, we can make progress in quite limited and quite conservative ways, and we should start there. When we think about the relationship between the empirical and the ethical, or the empirical and the normative, and more broadly thinking about what empirical ethics is trying to do, we can make progress by thinking about particular distinctive research strategies and questions, and simply track through the methodological approaches that follow from those strategies. Framed in terms of research questions is where I want to start. I think we immediately start to give shape to a whole range of different distinctions between kinds of integration or degrees of integration in the kinds of work that's done to answer different kinds of questions. And when we distinguish different degrees of integration, in particular what I'm going to call thin and thick integration, we also shine light on important but underexplored challenges for the fields. But to get there, to get to this account of empirical bioethics in these terms, I'm going to suggest that we need to actually focus on the field of bioethics itself, make some progress in understanding what that's trying to achieve, and show why empirical bioethics falls out of that and takes a particular shape. So one of the things that I've been pushing for some time is an account of bioethics as a field demarcated by a distinctive primary aim, namely the aim of answering what we've referred to in various ways as practical ought questions. In a recent paper that's just about to come out in bioethics, also going to probably make more enemies than friends, it's called The Myth of Translational Bioethics. We're arguing that essentially we're kind of reiterating our arguments for how to understand bioethics and how the arguments in favor of a translational approach are not well defended, not well justified. But we do that by looking again at the field and what makes up the field, particularly what the implications of that are for theory and practice in the field. The answering of practical ought questions focuses our attention on two component parts, practicality and oughtness. So our view about the nature of the field, this is the academic field in which we do research, is to achieve things that are practical, to enable change directly relevant to the world to be brought about, to be responsive, useful, and significant to those in practice, where practice could include practitioners, policymakers, or any other real-world stakeholders who face ethical problems of the biotype that we set out to address and support in our work. Oughtness captures the idea that in addition to being practically relevant in these terms, having the capacity for practical import, we are also justified in proposing those changes. That we are in the business of making well-reasoned and defensible arguments founded on universal standards of rationality. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute, because that might get people starting to heckle a little bit. Now, of course, not everybody doing bioethics is engaged in this primary practical ought question all the time. They might be addressing a range of subsidiary or secondary questions, all of which perhaps are in the service of these kinds of questions. And insofar as they're in the service of answering that kind of practical ought question, they probably count as bioethics. So we can have quite a broad capturing of a range of research activities, even if the primary purpose of a particular activity is not to answer a practical ought question directly, but but function in the service of answering it perhaps later on or in support of, in some sense. So in bioethics, our final research outputs are practical ethical claims. That's the fundamental product of the field, in my view. The answers we give to the practical questions we pose through the arguments we provide. Now, practical claims or practical ethical claims sound broad, but I want us to recognize that they can take many forms and are not particularly controversial, I don't think. I take it that much of what bioethics is trying to do are trying to make a wide range of ethical claims for a set of practical circumstances. The precise nature of that claim will depend on the nature of the research question and where the arguments take us. In particular, they may be directive, open-ended, or conceptual in nature, potentially. So one kind of practical ethical claim that the bioethicist will make here is a specific directive practical normative claim. And here's a couple of examples. A should do X in circumstances Z, or practice W is ethically justified. In order to enact W in circumstances Z, A should change X and Y. Thinking that's the kind of conclusions we might make. Sometimes our product of our bioethical inquiry and the answering of a practical law question will be the production of a broad framework of answers. For example, A should give due consideration to, let's say, principles V, W, X, and Y when deciding what to do in circumstances Z. Different kind of practical claim, but a practical claim nonetheless. Of course, the activity and the arguments might take us in a more conceptual direction. A should understand the principle or the concept of human dignity to mean this in a nursing home, let's say, in circumstances Z. Note here that all of these claims are made with reference to some circumstance in the world, which gets at the practicality element of the normativity. So, obviously, you probably figured out that accounting for bioethics in these terms places practical ethical argumentation at the very heart of what we are doing as researchers. Now, I don't want to suggest to you, I don't think we have to assume that putting argumentation front and center in the field implies a retreat into a philosophy-centric account of our activities. Because I take it that making good arguments is not solely the occupation of philosophers. If we're empirical social scientists trying to convince our reader that this is the best interpretation of how the world is, this particular social phenomenon should be explained in these terms, we have to make an argument to defend that position, and we have to defend it, obviously in a different way to how we defend an ethical claim, an empirical claim in this sense. But somebody might challenge it and say, no, I think that other alternative interpretation is better. Defend yourself against that. That's merely the exercise of argumentation, of course. But I also think that one reason why this doesn't take us into philosophy, back into philosophy, you might say, is that the practicality element of bioethics takes the process of developing these arguments away from what we take the purpose of applied philosophical inquiry to be. But I take it that bioethics is importantly different from implied philosophy in the sense of the force of the practicality component. Insofar as an applied philosopher, moral philosopher, will be interested in a particular practical context or a case, they will be using it in the service of a philosophical aim, not a practical aim. And so there's an important distinction to draw there that preserves, I guess, or carves out, that protects bioethics from being run into or owned by or under the control of an applied philosopher, I think. I also don't think this is as controversial as it might first appear, because I think when we think about what it means to make arguments and accept universal standards of justification in argument, that's the oughtness component of bioethics, is simply to acknowledge what we do every day in our lives as people capable of reasoning together in a logically sound and coherent way. If you were to say to me now, no, I disagree, I take it you've accepted my claim, because that is arguing. Right? You're responding to the claims I'm making. You will call upon me to respond to an objection to one element of my argument. You'll call me to account and I'll respond in that way. I go so far as to say this: denying these universal standards of justification in the way in which we argue about practical ought matters is to deny the possibility of meaningful exchange between us. We can't communicate together unless we have some general assumptions about how we engage and respond to subjective communicative terms around argumentation. Note also that accepting the universal standards of justification in arguing doesn't imply anything about the universality of ethical values, i.e., the content of the arguments about which we argue. Of course, we can disagree about the values that should feed into the content of our argument, and that will be where we legitimately disagree about the bioethical course of action. It's just to say that the structure of the argument or the assumptions we make about how we respond and argue together are agreed upon universally in that sense, that very thin sense of it. Now, I do accept that there's much disagreement within philosophy and beyond about what these universal standards consist in, but I don't think we need to be too ambitious in defining them. I think we know most of the time how we make arguments, how we rationally deliberate together, and how we make progress in defending courses of action as justified or not in the broadest of senses. Okay, that's laying out bioethics, and I hope that what I'll say around empirical bioethics in a moment will fall out of that in an important sense, and particularly my own take on what we're trying to achieve in empirical bioethics. But I also want to clear the ground now about the empirical and the normative as a sort of side move here, before we get to empirical bioethics, to think again a little bit about what it means to work with the two components that are taken to be part of the empirical bioethics enterprise. And again, I don't think it's particularly controversial myself, but others may disagree, and we'll no doubt bash that out. I take it ultimately there is an important point of distinction to make between an is and an ought. That in the social sciences, and that's my particular focus given the kind of data that we're using in empirical bioethics, collecting and analyzing quantitative or qualitative data gives us the material, gives us the basic basic criteria essentially to make sound, in the argument sense of the word, factual claims about how the world is. It's a descriptive activity. It's a rich descriptive activity, and it's one that will go beyond mere description to explanation, but it's still, in that sense, descriptive. On the other side of the coin is ethical analysis, where we use practical ethical reasoning skills to make conceptual and normative claims about how the world ought to be. And insofar as we're prescribing how the world ought to be, this is prescriptive. And as we saw from our account of bioethics that I wanted to suggest we should accept, this is part of the business of the field. Now, I think some confusions can arise here that might need a little bit of time just to flash out. And again, this might be the source of where we disagree if we think that is and oughts should be running together much more closely. It seems to me absolutely true and unproblematic to recognize that scientific or social scientific inquiry is shaped directly by implicit normative commitments or values. We've learned a lot about that in important ways through the contributions of social scientists and beyond in the last few years. So data generation is in part the product of the political institutional norms that will have normative content. And so in that sense, scientific data, let's say, is not value neutral. It's framed by the types of things that scientists, funders, or the like value. And so these observations immediately show us how necessarily entangled facts and values are, it seems to me, in the world. But I'd also suggest that analysing these data is still an empirical process on the descriptive side of inquiry. And any further claim we'd want to make, let's say, for example, that science ought to be conducted or funded differently in light of some observations of problematic values we've identified in that research, requires further normative thinking and analysis. It's not settled by the descriptive work that we've done. Equally, it's well recognized that people have views about health or scientific practices that are characterized by fundamental ethical commitments, including those doing the inquiry themselves. And these data capture normative ethical content about the things that people think are defensible or not, valuable or not, good or bad, right or wrong, and they can give reasons for why that is. But again, I want to suggest that analyzing the values that people hold in context is still empirical. Studying how people hold values or value things is an empirical or descriptive mode of inquiry. And again, any further claim, for example, that we should accept or deny the views that we hear and reshape practice in science or healthcare accordingly, requires further normative analysis. So in my view, the difference between the descriptive and the normative, the empirical and the normative, if you prefer, is best understood in terms of modes of justification in arguments, not in the basic content, because as we've seen, facts, values, empirical normativity, they're very closely entangled in the ways in which the world takes shape. But this is a distinction I think that we can hold on to in our discussions. I would want to. And this is how they differ in terms of their modes of justification. Is this claim about what people think or do a correct representation of the world, such that one has good reason to accept it? The normative side, is this claim about what we ought to do ethically justified, such that one has good reason to accept it? In both cases, we need argumentation to give us the reasons and the kind of the force of the claim that we want to make to answer that correctly or not, to reinforce the answer that we give and to defend it. Okay, back to the empirical term, right back to the start. So when people talk about the empirical turn and the rise of empirical bioethics, the generic and generalized view that's expressed is one in which we want to ensure that ethical arguments we make are appropriately connected to the real world, that the real world matters in some sense. And so the often implicit idea that's part of this claim is that our arguments in bioethics, our answers to practical ought questions, are improved in some important sense if they're either sensitive to or directly responsive to data about what happens in the world and why it happens. But I think we can go further than that. Based on, if you accept what I claim about the nature of bioethics itself, we have a field that is necessarily concerned with the practical relevance of its arguments. And it seems to me that that field will be significantly advantaged by immersing itself in the practice, in the empirical, in the real world, by sensitizing its inquiry to the world outside the academy in which the problems arise that people like us are trying to resolve. Because we have this practicality component as well as the oughtness component in my view, what defines us as inquirers in bioethics. So, what does that mean for how we go about inquiry? So I think it's important to recognize that practical ought questions in bioethics take multiple forms and connect in important ways to making practical ought claims. So in considering the varying methodologies for embracing the empirical or integrating the empirical with the normative in the field, I think we can helpfully dissect overarching strategies that try to seek how to attend to practical ethical understanding in the real world context. And I want to suggest that there's a helpful distinction to make between thin integration between empirical and normative thinking in bioethics, which is largely unproblematic, partly holds on to established alignments between disciplinary contribution, raises some tricky methodological questions, but is generally quite acceptable to most people, I think. And then we can turn to the thick integration between empirical and normative work, where I think we get to much more radical territory quite quickly. We're thinking about approaches that actually recast the relationship of inquiry between ethics and the real world, that could reflect much more radical philosophical, political, or moral commitments. And understanding those developments in the thick integration type of approaches of research require us to really look closely about the justifications that underpin why we should thickly integrate the empirical and the normative in the development of research methodologies. I want to suggest even further that these kinds of approaches really actually get a whole different way of developing ethical claims entirely and doing bioethics itself. I'm going to go through this quite quickly because I don't want to run out of time. I've got three strategies, or three kind of research questions that we might embark on that I think capture the thin approach to integration. This is not the entirety of the approach. It's just three examples, the kind of things that strike me as emblematic of thin approaches to integrating empirical and normative work, and the kinds of contribution that empirical work can make to the field. Identifying ethical issues, filling out the empirical premises of ethical arguments, and evaluating ethical arguments or interventions when implemented into practice. The nature of the integration here really matters. I've got various tropes that sort of outline how that goes. The first strategy, studying ethical issues in practice, moves us from understanding something descriptively about ethics in context, setting up a next phase of prescriptive ethical analysis of the issues identified. This is a horizon scanning activity, and there are multiple examples every month in bioethics journals of this kind of work. What might typically happen is that a researcher goes out into the field, the practice, the setting, and looks for what real world problems people are actually facing, particularly when new developments are happening, or new policies are being considered, or new technologies are being invented and applied. Some of these strategies could be small in their scope. We could be looking at how families make decisions together when a person loses capacity. It could be very big. We'd be exploring the kind of ethical issues that arise when we transform our health system into one driven by AI models, for example. It could be local. We could take a very focused micro-sociological account of the kinds of ethical problems that arise, perhaps in a scientific laboratory or a small group of hospitals. Or we could go and survey what the ethical issues facing all doctors in the world are and give a much more globalized account of those kinds of problems. What we're doing here is empirical work. We're making sense of the world as faced as ethically problematic by those in it, in an area that we think is relevant and ripe for further ethical study. There's no precise normative ethical analysis going on here, in the sense that we are not then necessarily having to address these issues. We could do if we want to do in the next stage of our work. But this strategy stops usually at the point at which we identify what those ethical problems are, either through qualitative research or perhaps through a review methodology, perhaps as well, in which we could go about this. So it sets up further inquiry once we know what the form of the issues are on the ground. But even here, arguments are needed and judgments are required of us, I think. And I think when I work with people on this kind of strategy, big problems can arise quite quickly, and they actually involve a bit of normative judgment here and there as well. One problem, of course, is that people in the real world don't tend to have the same meaning or sense of the word ethics as we might have, or we expect to hear from them. So it's quite difficult to know how to discriminate between an ethical issue that you're trying to identify, perhaps, and another kind of challenge that the person tells you is of importance to them in some good or bad sense of the word. So I thought we'd think about ethics as a dirty word in this kind of context. How do we deal with that problem? How do we deal with finding common ground about the nature of what we're trying to investigate, interrogate, and discover together as researcher and participant? And that is get to a different question, I think, which is that how far should we go a priori with a range of ethical concerns that give us the rationale for even asking this question in the first place? A person is kind of out there because they have some sense that consent might be a problem that they want to illuminate in practice. What if it never comes up? What if you never find it? What should you, if anything, start with asking questions about? Should you even ask anything about any ethical worries that get you to the initial starting point? And of course, how to acknowledge the researcher's own judgments about what is significant and worthy of attention can be part of that, and point towards reflexivity in the ways that we were discussing in Brisbane earlier in the week. Okay, strategy 2. Adding the empirical social scientific analysis, like we add sugar to the making of our cakes, where the cake in development is a prescriptive normative ethical analysis. A bit forced, I'm sorry. Okay. This, I think, is the kind of way in which, if there's philosophers in the room, they would most commonly understand empirical work to play in an applied philosophical piece of work or the development of a normative ethical argument. What typically happens in this strategy is that we have the argument, an argument's been made, and we need empirical data or evidence to flesh out one premise of that argument. Without that data, the argument's incomplete because it's not sufficiently practical. So any argument that hinges upon, let's say, welfare is or well-being type considerations, is going to have this kind of strategy somewhere in it, in my view. Because for a well-being type argument to have practical force, to be tailored and translated in the right way to context, we've got to know something about well-being in that context. Now, I don't think that's just true for well-being type arguments, but they're the easiest ones, I think, to focus on here. So here we go, look, an argument about resource allocation in health. We've got our arguments. We can criticize it, but that's the argument that we've got. We ought to distribute health resources in a way that maximizes cost effectiveness. Unless we know something about the ways in which different health options maximize cost effectiveness, that argument is a meaningful, abstract, floating claim. We know nothing about how to actually resource distribute our limited resources. So we go out there and we say which of the different health options we study, which of those will maximize cost effectiveness. Turns out from our empirical work, it's health package A. So we have a conclusion for the practicality of our argument. We've got to provide health package A. So the empirical data is providing premise 2 in this argument and allows us to get to a practical ought claim of the kind that I described earlier. There's some concerns about this. It looks like the empiricist, social scientist usually, is sort of enslaved to the philosopher. The philosopher does all the hard work, they got their argument, and we just come and add a little bit of an ingredient here and there. And Erica Hames famously was very concerned about this kind of limited and undervalued, in her view, I think, role for the potential for empirical work, describing it not unproblematically now, I think, as the handmaiden of philosophical analysis. But there are other problems as well, because our rich empirical work in context might actually reveal some unexpected challenges to the normative premises of the argument. Maybe we go out there, we study the world, and someone says, maybe it's not all about cost effectiveness. Maybe there's more going on in resource allocation than the maximization of cost effectiveness. The potential for empirical work to throw up new normative insights worthy of further normative analysis can't easily be accommodated unless we go all the way back to the drawing board and abandon the philosophical argument we've made about cost effectiveness or welfare or such like. Okay, third thin integration strategy is the reverse of the first. Here, we have done our prescriptive normative ethical analysis. We have a good argument ready for implementation, and we are seeking then to hand over to the empirical social scientists to do some evaluation work on that argument when worked up and applied in practice. We call this strategy evaluating ethical interventions in practice. Let's take something like advanced directives. Now, we can defend this practice in multiple ways, but let's imagine that a group of bioethicists have identified what for them is a good practical ought claim for the use of advanced directives in a hospital setting. This is a practice that we can use to make sure that a person's autonomy can continue to be respected after that person loses capacity through enacting the advanced directive that they made prior to the loss of capacity, what we might call respect for precedent autonomy. What the empirical work does here is it looks at, when we apply our advanced directive in context, does this intervention function as it ought when implemented in practice? In other words, does it properly uphold the ethical value that it was designed to uphold when designed? Is it in fact respecting precedent autonomy when implemented in practice? Again, there were some concerns perhaps about how we'd go about this. Once again, when we study through evaluation methodologies, the implementation of ethical interventions, we might think about an ethics committee or an IRB as another ethics intervention we could evaluate. We might be drawn to reasons for thinking that the very innate reasons why this thing was introduced in the first place are unsound. So we look at how people are actually using advanced directives in our evaluation of them, and people are making claims about things other than respect for precedent autonomy. They're making claims about well-being or the rights of family members or something. Once again, not clear what we can do with that. We have some important normative reason-based work that's coming out of our empirical study, but the argument's done and dusted. We're now just evaluating whether it's implemented or not in the correct way. We're going to have to go back to the very initial justification for that intervention if we want to take things further. Okay, from thin to thick integration, this is supposed to be it's my nieces, supposed to be hugging in a kind of thick integration type way. This is the much more closer relationship between the empirical and the normative. So, more can be said about all of those three thin methodological approaches for connecting the value of the empirical to the normative and vice versa. And I think also there are particular challenges that need to be addressed within them. But I think they stand alone, and I think they stand as relatively unproblematic because of the ways in which disciplinary commitments are aligned or not in the relationship. But for many people, including, I think, John and myself, these strategies are not all we are concerned about or interested in when we think about empirical bioethics, and perhaps don't realize the full potential of the value that the empirical work we do can bring to the exercise of normative analysis. And I think the intuition is something like this. Our arguments have to be much more responsive to the real world, and these passing the baton type integration methods allow for. Or perhaps put a different way, we should be making arguments that are much more directly shaped by people's views, attitudes, reasons, and experiences as unearthed in the empirical research process. This is where things get really, really tough, I think, because as soon as we start to think about this relationship between drawing much more heavily on empirical work in the formulation of ethical arguments, we start having to look carefully about what it means to justify this move from empirical or this kind of closer relationship between facts and values, or is's and oughts. So what we've seen, I think, are multiple strategies for justifying thicker integration in empirical bioethics. This gets us into some quite deep territory, but I think it's worth looking in detail at these justifications because they point us towards very different methodological travels. And we'll identify different people that we know who do different kinds of things in different kind of ways for different kinds of reasons. So I want to suggest, and this is not, again, particularly formal distinction, it's just I think we can use to help us to navigate these debates. It's four kinds of strategies: meta-ethical justification strategies, political justification strategies, normative justification strategies, and what I'm calling meta-philosophical justification strategies. The meta-ethical justification strategies for this thick integration of the empirical and the normative predominate, I think. The fundamental idea here is to go back to the very basics of what ethical phenomena are and how we understand the nature of moral knowledge in the world. So I think all of these justifications in different kinds of ways and with different kinds of radicalness connect to a fundamental claim about the nature of ethics itself and how the relationship between facts and values follows from that claim, either in the denial of a distinction between facts and values or a much more complex intersection of the two. And we have the intuitionist positions, the phenomenological positions, the hermeneutic positions, pragmatist positions, the ethical naturalist positions, and the moral particularist positions. I won't say any more about those now, but I'm sure we can share more discussion about them later if people are interested. But unsurprisingly, they all take meta-ethical stances where the world outside of the armchair has a very important role to play in thinking about what makes up ethical claims and ethical facts themselves. Now, I'm just going to raise a few kind of concerns and sort of worries or discussion points really about all of these approaches. Founding a justification on a specific meta-ethical view, I think, puts the field on a back foot immediately, because these views are contested and far from settled. And it seems very problematic to try to articulate the value of a methodological stance by settling a very old debate about the nature of ethics itself. Because if you don't buy that first principled commitment, you're not going to buy, it seems to me, much of what follows. And one of the things that I think that comes out of this maybe is a siloing problem. There are going to be people who commit themselves to the phenomenological stance who would accept certain methodological approaches that are not going to be accepted by the intuitionists or the ethical naturalists or the pragmatists or so on. And so the field is split on first principle terms. At the very least, each paper has to justify the fundamental methodological stance that it stands from, it seems to me, to gain general traction and acceptance within the field. if one doesn't share that stance. Okay, second mode of justification, political. Here it seems to me we justify the thick integration of the empirical and the normative by recourse to a politically defensible approach to settling ethical disputes, usually in the context of a dispute in practice that relates to public policy, through a commitment to deliberation, and normally a justificatory strategy of consensus building that involves the recruitment of and the discussions with members of the public. So a very common and increasingly dominant political justification of this kind is one that embeds the thick integration of empirical bioethics in an account of democratic representativeness, where producing policy-orientated claims will draw on those democratic consensus building techniques developed within politics or for politics and matters of public policy setting. And so we see the use of things like citizens' juries coming into the field, it seems to me, with these justificatory standpoints in place. I can see whether people agree with that, but that's my take on it. But again, what do we think? One immediate concern might be that when we move from philosophical standards of argument, justification in argument, to political standards of justification, for example, the reliance on consensus rather than ethical justification itself, we move from, it seems to me, foregrounding philosophical or academic norms around arguments to political norms developed from an entirely different context. It also seems right to me to point out that whilst bioethicists might become involved in setting a policy and being involved in public policy matters, the activity of doing academic research in the field is not itself a policy-making activity. And so relying or justifying our claims on the basis of political norms could be problematic. It also looks quite worrying to rely on a particular set of approaches that foreground political philosophical positions that are not widely accepted universally in the world. And so those defending these kinds of approaches and this kind of justificatory strategy face a similar challenge to those adopting the first metaethical strategy. They've got to basically defend democracy before they can defend the practical ethical claims that they make, particularly if they're applying their reasons and their justifications to non-democratic societies, it seems to me. And again, we seem to be a bit on the back foot if we have to defend a deliberative democratic commitment in political philosophical terms before we actually get to doing our bioethics. Normative justifications for thickly integrating the empirical and the ethical. This might be linked in an important sense to the political account I just gave, but I think differs in ways that we might want to treat it separate. The idea here is that we can justify our integration of the empirical and the normative by recourse to a preemptively determined guiding set of normative ethical commitments, i.e. by foregrounding our basic moral obligations, our moral presuppositions for how we should change the world in the very formulation of our research question itself, or perhaps by showing how we can correct pre-existing normative blind spots in the kinds of inquiry we've done on those questions previously. So take Jackie Scully's explicit commitment to gender and social justice to motivate her feminist empirical bioethics approach to be an example of this. What drives that rationale for the methodology is a preemptive requirement and commitment to addressing harms or wrongs facing certain kinds of marginalized groups, women and others, in the account she gives. And that drives that position, develops a particular way of practicing empirical bioethics in which the normative is interwoven into the empirical process itself in a much more direct way than the other ones. I think one of the most difficult questions for the field, and I think this is actually one of the most unanswered or kind of poorly addressed questions, is when and how and if we're justifiable in our studies to preemptively endorse particular kinds of values from the off, a priori, in the formulation of a practical or question, and how we retain the value of openness, skepticism, and agnosticism, at least when it comes to uncertainty in the real world regarding the manifestation or resolution of a particular problem. Now, don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm not suggesting we abandon commitments to social justice. We want to maintain those commitments. But how we translate those commitments into our scrutiny of a particular manifestation of an ethical problem in the world seems to me to be a complicated question. How we are open to challenge, open to other interpretations of that basic principle or a clash of principles looks important. But I take it to be a foundational question for all of us, which is what is legitimate normatively to commit to in the starting point of addressing a practical or question? If it's merely the commitment to a set of overarching values, we have separate questions and hard issues to address around how, in context, we normatively reason around those values in the settling of a practical ethical problem in ways that are open and agnostic about the formulation and requirements of those values in context. There's also a slight worry that this kind of justification might fall foul of some of the original criticisms that were directed towards social scientists' observations about the normative commitments inherent to medical sociology. So Adam Hedgecoe basically gives this account of what social scientists do. This is what, like, as a medical sociologist, of course you're thinking like this. We don't need empirical bioethics as a separate discipline or field if this is the account we want to give of the justification we want to provide. Okay, and finally, metaphilosophical approaches. This is the approach that I favor, and it tries to justify the thick integration of the empirical and the ethical by recourse to a view about the purpose, nature, and criteria for practical ethical argumentation in real-world settings. It tries to divest itself of any substantial or metaethical, political, or normative set of commitments in doing so, by arguing that when we come to make good practical ethical arguments in the world, on ones that capture the oughtness and the practicality requirements, we are in the business of developing arguments with two elements. Arguments that are convincing, those that are rational, logical, and well-reasoned, and those that actually convince. Those that are taken seriously, can be accepted and worked with by people in practice because they're adequately responsive to real-world constraints, experiences, and perspectives. Now, as people are frequently in the world convinced by unconvincing arguments, we can give many examples of that, and many convincing arguments are treated as some incomprehensible claptrap, it seems to me that we have reasons for thinking about an approach to our study that co-produces arguments in context in ways that try to produce arguments that can be both convincing in the oughtness sense of the term, and that actually convince those people in practice such that they can be implemented and worked and applied. Now, in my view, this approach takes us not towards the integration of the empirical with the ethical, but entirely recasting empirical research methods as new, open, critical spaces for deliberative reasoning with stakeholders, the co-production of arguments in ways that do not require adherence to the political standards that we heard before. Okay, I'm going to let people criticize me. I won't go through that because I'm running out of time. Okay, as John and I have shown in some of the work we've done, different justifications underpinning thick integration generate entirely different requirements for producing normative claims. Many different methodological proposals track the different justifications put forward. So, if you accept the political justification for thick integration, you get citizens, juries, and deliberative political methods. If you accept the intuitionist view, you get perhaps collective reflective equilibrium for policy, or CREP. From another metaethical position, John's position, you get reflexive balancing. They all fall out in importantly different ways from the original justifications. In fact, John and I and a colleague, Rachel Davies, who led this work, found 32 distinct methodological thick integration approaches, tracking different approaches, different kind of methodological strategies that really hinge on the justifications that underpin them. So to draw this to a conclusion, I think we understand empirical bioethics as a family of approaches, addressing distinctive research questions in ways that connect the ethical and the ethical and the empirical in thinner or thicker ways. That the rationale for all of these approaches in this family of methodologies falls out of recognizing that bioethics is a field committed to answering practical questions, as distinct from applied philosophy or the social sciences. That from the standpoint of our kind of interdisciplinary connectedness, thin integration approaches are relatively unproblematic, that they connect the empirical and the normative because they are thin on integration. The distinctive and separate roles that they play means that they don't raise the same kinds of challenges thick integration approaches raise or the kind of justifications that are needed. There are some tricky methodological questions still, I think, in those thin methodological approaches anyway. And finally, final slide. Research strategies that call for thick integration give rise to quite controversial and unsettled theoretical, political, and methodological issues. And if we think there's a rationale for these more thick integration type approaches, where the empirical and the ethical are much more interwoven in inquiry, we're going to face up quite seriously to those kinds of issues and work out where to go from them. The very idea of what it means to justify a practical ethical claim is at stake here. Who should be a participant in that activity is up for grabs, as is how they should participate. If settling disagreements requires resolving age-old debates in metaethics or endorsing established commitments predominant in the West, where does that leave the scholarship of the field moving forward internationally? As John and I perhaps suggested in another piece of work we've done together, maybe in the face of all this disagreement and uncertainty, it's only a very small number of basic common research standards that we can articulate, upon which we can speak to each other and find some common ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you. People can hear, right? Okay, Right. Thank you so much. So we have a khichdi, of course, and it's a beautiful way to look at the different analytical approaches, but also sociological and metaphysical and metaethical positions which we have here. But because we need to stick to the time, but let's take the one burning question and then continue during our panel discussion. What do you say? Any burning questions? Right.
I just wanted to ask you about your kind of binary between social sciences being descriptive and ethics as being prescriptive. Troubles me because your absolute template social science paper ends with recommendations for policy and practice, which is a normative aspect, and that normative aspect is just is done in every social science paper. So to me, that collapse especially your thin empirical bioethics and social science collapse into each other at that point.
Yeah, great. I mean, that's helpful. I mean, I definitely don't want to suggest that social scientists are on the descriptive side and philosophers are on the prescriptive side. Just so there's a distinction to make between those two sides. So I take it you're absolutely right. And indeed, this is a bit like where Adam Hedgecote comes from, I think, with his critiques of empirical bioethics, is that the social scientists are doing the normative work already. But I do think that what it means to move between the two sides has to be carefully articulated and defended. So, insofar as the social scientist is making normative claims, the question, I guess, for me would be, to what extent is the oughtness requirements associated with those claims properly implemented? But are they making well-reasoned, clear defense and such like arguments? They probably are in the work that they're doing, in which case they're just doing what I'm describing in this way, thickly or thinly integrated.
So where's the line then?
Where's the line? The line is between the prescriptive and the descriptive as categories, rather than between disciplinary commitments or practices, I think. So, we can choose whether we take a prescriptive approach to our research or a descriptive approach, it seems to me. But insofar as we take a line of that kind, the standards by which we justify our claim seem to be different in an important way.
John?
I mean, the way that I've always thought about the difference, I think that Mike is quite right in that it's about articulating different kinds of practice, not necessarily pigeonholing people as social scientists or ethicists. But the distinction that I see is that if it's bioethics and prescriptive work, the research work is about articulating and justifying, working out what the normative claim should be. Whereas if you look at the normative claims made in typical social science work, they might be the starting point, and you're looking at how they can be implemented and how they're understood in practice. But the work isn't about justifying the normative claims. It's about understanding and implementing them rather than working out what they ought to be. Is that?
But you work towards those normative claims in the social science paper.
You
And so
don't-
I really
Yeah.
struggle with this as,
Yeah.
as someone who claims to be an empirical
Yeah.
bioethicist and has sometimes been told by reviewers that I'm not.
I'm very excited to continue these conversations, and definitely I'm sure we'll keep heading to this fact value and then normative and prescriptive conversations. So let's go for a short break and then come back at 3:30.
Great.
But of course, we are going to continue the conversation during the break too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. No, but yeah.
See everyone else struggling.
Talking about
Wait, can I just? You muted the room.
It's also nice.
Was the recording?
I used to.
Yeah, I do.
But I would love that when you're recording.
It's
Right, oh, yes, yes.
Depends on I've just done like.
Yes.
Supriya for a moment.
Thank you, Julie. So hi, everyone. I see that there are some questions. We'll just pick soon from the online. But before we continue, I'll just quickly read out like quick bios of panel discussants we have here. Jonathan Ives, professor at Bristol Medical School, University of Bristol. Of course, you all have already know much about Jonathan Ives. He works across clinical and research ethics, and he has particular expertise in empirical bioethics methodology. And Dr. Catherine McKay is a senior lecturer at Sydney Health Ethics, and Catherine's research brings a philosophical perspective to issues in public health ethics, works at the intersection of moral theory, feminist theory, and philosophy. And we have Miriam Versma, is a PhD candidate at Sydney Health Ethics at the University of Sydney, and she has an undergraduate and postgraduate qualifications in psychology, as well as a Master of Public Health. And we have Dr. Sarah Hammond online. Can you see her? Yes, we have her. Hi, Sarah, online. Is Melbourne-based medical oncologist. She's also a PhD candidate with Sydney Health Ethics, exploring ethical and epistemic implications of novel and emerging trends across the cancer clinical trials landscape. And we have Shun. Do we have? We have Shun. Okay. Okay, we
not have a video on.
Yes.
we have Shun online is an
Shin, if you want, you can pop your camera on.
yeah.
That way we'll be able to see you. There
Thank
she
you.
is.
Yes,
Good morning
hi.
or good middle of the
Nice to
night.
see you.
Hello. How are you all?
Yes, good. Hi again. So her research interests focus on the impact of race in clinical and health system complexity on medical practice. And we have Dr. Eve St. James Aquino, is a physician and philosopher with expertise in applied ethics and philosophy of medicine. And he's from Achieve, that is Australian Centre for Health Engagement, Evidence and Values at the University in Wollongong. So we have a lot of conversations already. We have been started. I see from the earlier session. So the plan for this is each one of us have a perspective commentary of 3 articles which we shared, and each one has 5 minutes. And then we'll start having conversation for 30 minutes. And then we have a rest of the conversation open for the here. Yeah. Great. Let's start with Dr. Catherine.
Oh, I'm first. Okay. Oh, thanks. Sorry, I got crap here. Thanks so much. This is really interesting to be a part of because I don't do empirical bioethics. So I'm sort of coming from the outsider slash philosophical bioethics side of things. So I'm kind of responding partly to the papers, but also partly to your talk, Mikey, partly because your talk was much updated from some of the papers. And I guess when I was thinking about my comment, I decided to give it a title so that I could kind of keep in mind what I was thinking about while I was reading. And the title is Chauvinism, Relativism, and Vision. Because I think that these are kind of the main, I guess, concerns that come up for me thinking about empirical bioethics and sort of what it is. So, I mean, the one question that you raised and discussed is how connected are is and ought claims? What is the nature of the entanglement of descriptions with prescriptions? And a certain claim of empirical bioethics is that it connects oughts to is, and that it's responsive to the real world. And that was something that came up, I think, a few times in the talk and a few times in the papers. That this is the world outside of the academy, that the academy is not the real world, but the real world is something outside of that, that we have to have some kind of special access to that we as academics don't normally have access to. So we need to become something like, I don't know, an empiricist, I guess, to gain access to the real world. And this makes me wonder about whether or not there are questions in bioethics that cannot be answered empirically, things that we can't find out in the real world that are relevant, that are important, that we should think about or that are actually maybe really important to think about. And so maybe some kind of modeling is useful here, maybe some kinds of abstract reasoning, dare I say, philosophical reasoning, could be helpful for some of those things. And one of the examples actually from the talk was the example of, the option of health packages and how we would look out to the world and we would see, oh, health package A or something fits better. But you can't empirically study the alternatives that are not yet instantiated. So you can only empirically compare those that are out there already. So this connects to my sort of broader concern for bioethics, is that I want bioethics to be visionary. I want bioethics to be more than a handmaiden to the status quo. Certainly more than a handmaiden to the medical establishment, but more than a handmaiden to the research agenda as well. And there was some comment in the papers that we read about sort of like social science being handmaiden to philosophy. And I'm more interested in like the scaled up version, is bioethics the handmaiden to the sort of political power establishment. So if bioethics is going to remain visionary, then there's some sense in which it can't, at least always, be empirical, because it has to sometimes be thinking about things that don't exist, that could exist or should. And this, I think, connects to my background as a feminist bioethicist. Feminist bioethics hasn't really positioned itself as empirical bioethics. Like if we're trying to subdivide the field, there are people who would call themselves feminist bioethicists who wouldn't also call themselves empirical bioethicists. But feminist bioethics is responsive. That's what it came out of. It was a response to philosophy, it was a response to the kind of status quo bioethics, but it's always political. It's not always empirical, but it's always in context. It's always responsive to context and driven by context. Not to say that it hasn't been without problems, not to say that it hasn't been blind in some ways also, but it's at least been motivated with an eye to the actual, the real world, if we want to call it that. So, I guess I have a few thoughts about that are a little bit disconnected. They connect along sort of two themes. One is empirical ethics just an overwrought response to the critique of sort of ivory tower philosophical bioethics? Is the response of empirical bioethics to try to absorb sociology into philosophical bioethics otherwise, and then do a bunch of hand-wringing over how well that works? What are the distinctions between politics, philosophy, religion, sociology, history? All involve the other at a certain level. So are we just sort of hand-wringing about where the borders are in a way that we don't really need to do? Is it really helpful to bring the field forward? And I guess that another question that we were talking about over coffee is some of this hand-wringing created by the kind of constant identity crisis that bioethics seems to be caught in. It's like, what are we? And we're never anything. But isn't that maybe just okay? Isn't that maybe just what bioethics is? And then I guess the final note here is that, of course, empirical bioethics comes with its own risks. And one of the risks is that it will replicate the problems of power that we see in other empirically driven fields. So we see, and I think Mikey kind of touched on this, but because science is not value neutral and doing empirical work is not value neutral, there's a risk that in responding to the ivory tower critique, those people end up just sort of taking their own questions, their own thoughts about the world and moving into the world and replicating the issues of power and evidence. So there's a real deep need for reflexivity, which is something that I know Supriya works on a lot and gives a lot of thought to. And this requires political awareness, again, driving the connection between philosophy, bioethics, politics, history, culture. And I think that overall, the worry that I have about, I guess, especially the model that we landed on in your talk, Mike, is that, I mean, this is going to sound, I don't know, I'm going to get heavily criticized for this, I think, but co-design is like a big buzzword right now, co-producing stuff. It has a ton of methodological challenges. I'm only going to mention one here, which is that we may compromise the vision, that we end up holding bioethics to a standard so low it cannot make visionary change by constantly compromising to the status quo, and especially if we're doing things with medical power holders like the medical elite. So that's the end of my comment. Thanks for entertaining me.
Thank you. That's like, wow, like you have touched on so many aspects, especially on politics and historical situatedness and whom are we responding to. But I'm sure we'll pick on this soon. And let's hear from Sarah. I'm going to time it.
Sure. Thanks very much for the opportunity to reflect. I feel very humbled because I am very much newly pouring into, I guess, ethics as an early career person. But my background is as a physician. And so I have very much grown up within a world where unless you can show me the facts, I will not believe you. Or at least that is, I guess, the world that medicine operates in. So in many respects, in entering into bioethics, I have found it fascinating that, without sounding dismissive, but I've found it fascinating that this is a topic of rigorous debate within bioethics, the concept of empirical bioethics, because in many respects in my world in medicine, usually the need for empirical data is just taken for granted. And I guess that sort of reflects the positivist stance that we operate in, whether or not we recognize that to be the case or not. But I was particularly interested in reading the papers as one quote that I just wanted to read out from one of the papers. Broadly speaking, philosophical argument provides the tools for a claim to be justified and hence to be convincing, whereas empirical evidence can enable an argument to be connected in some ways to actual situations, and so to be the one that can actually convince, which I guess, I found interesting, as mentioned, because in general, in my world at least, we would assume that there would be empirical justification for any claims that are made, whether or not they're ethical or otherwise. But I guess, particularly in reflecting on the talk that Michael just gave, at the same time within the medical world that we would assume that facts would support any claims, we probably also would be unlikely often to acknowledge that facts are not value neutral either. So in some ways, there's, I guess, a tension within that as well. And that's been particularly interesting within my area of practice, which is oncology. There's a really sort of, I guess, rigorous debate at the moment around how we set up clinical trials and what are the best outcomes or objectives to be aiming for. And there's a group of oncologists and others that are advocating for a shift in the way that we design clinical trials, which they've labelled broadly as the common sense oncology movement, or CSO. And even as exemplified in the nature of that title, I think without realizing it, they're imposing a set of values on some set of outcomes to be aimed for than others. And that's been interesting to watch, in part because I think everyone would like to think that they operate under common sense. But the fact that certain groups of actors have chosen to label or categorize some objectives as that more so than others, without necessarily, I guess, providing a good justification of that, perhaps belies the fact that we are remiss in not acknowledging that facts are not value neutral in of themselves as well. So I guess from my perspective, it's interesting in medicine how, on the one hand, we assume that facts are evident beneath any claims, while at the same time not always realizing that they're not value neutral. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's like touching on the other aspect of positivist framework and how we respond, I mean, especially within the empirical bioethics research. Let's now hear from you.
Thanks, Supriya. Is that working?
Yeah.
Nice. Okay, so Supriya mentioned that my background's in psychology, so like Sarah, a very strong positivist approach, and so it's a bit uncomfortable coming into bioethics for me, and compared to some of these guys, I'm a relative newcomer. One thing I was thinking about on the way here is how, and I guess what the papers raised for me as well, is questions around legitimacy and quality in empirical bioethics and in the different approaches that we use. Like I said, I'm new to this area, and I guess throughout my project, my PhD, it's an empirical bioethics project. I've really spent quite a bit of time asking myself, how do I incorporate the practical is what my participants have told me through my empirical data and through interviews with how do I move them to making a more normative claim? And one thing I found with doing empirical bioethics over the last couple of years, that they're, like Mikey and John, you say in your paper, there's not a great deal of agreement as to what counts as good empirical bioethics. And I guess I'm interested from both of you, what does good empirical bioethics project, what do they look like to you? And how about bad bioethics? Because I think sometimes, and Bridget, you touched on before that when you got was it an article submitted that you were told that you weren't an empirical bioethicist? And that's something that I'm finding. My papers might go to review to social scientists. and they are not familiar necessarily with the methodologies that we use in empirical bioethics, and they might lean towards those more positivist approaches. So how, I guess, another question, I'm all about questions today. How do we as young or early career researchers navigate using these novel methodologies that may not be seen as legitimate by those who are reviewing our articles, or by those when we're entering into further on down the track, going for funding? Because it becomes quite, I guess, a bit of a game of hit and miss. Not all of your papers, when you're doing empirical bioethics, are going to go to a bioethics journal. Some of them are going to be just mapping the lay of the land and answering those secondary, as Sheehan says, questions. And even then, people have a problem with some of the methodologies used as well. So yeah, I would just like to hear your opinions on how we can navigate that, and what, I guess, what are we searching for as we progress through with the field? What do we want high quality empirical bioethics to look like? And what is legitimate bioethics as well? That's it for me. I'm short and sweet.
Great.
Sorry, I think they're.
Hello.
Oh, yeah, I don't.
Hello. I hope this one is better.
Is this better? You can just go ahead.
We've got
Yeah.
people listening here in the room too. and
Okay.
They're happy.
Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah, they've checked it. I think it's as good as
So
it.
thanks, Mikey. And I think I am going to largely respond to the presentation earlier. So a little bit more background for me, because I think that might explain better my own experience. So I'm both a philosopher and a clinician, although non-practicing clinician. And my PhD project was completely on theoretical bioethics and philosophy of medicine. I looked at the ethical practice, I looked at the practice of pathologizing ugliness in cosmetic surgery, where cosmetic surgeons claim that unattractive features are diseases that should be treated through surgery. And I did not do any kind of empirical work. I did a lot of conceptual analysis of health and disease, which is massive in philosophy of medicine. How do we define disease? I also looked at definitions and conceptualization of beauty and ugliness, and then looked at where they overlap. And then when I moved to Achieve, that's when I started my journey when doing or using empirical methods in bioethics, looking at the ethics of artificial intelligence in diagnosis and screening. So in terms of that journey, I always felt like having, I guess, these three hats of being a philosopher, a clinician, and a social science researcher. Every domain that I go to, I feel a little bit incomplete. So if I'm in a philosophy department or attending a philosophy talk, because my issues are in bioethics, I always feel like you're not really a philosopher, or at least that's how I feel like. And then I go to a social science department or a convention, then I'm not really a social science researcher, because that's not where my PhD training was. And of course, if I'm in medicine, I'm not really a clinician, because I'm way too theoretical. So I guess when it comes to empirical bioethics, we are navigating those identities. And at some point, we do have to give up defending ourselves. You just want to answer your research question. And what are the methods that we can use to answer that research question? So when we talk about empirical bioethics, I think the first question that really comes to mind, who are we defending the method against? Because the way we defend it against philosophers would be different when we defend it against social scientists. And I don't think we can please everyone. At some point, I did have to accept it is its own thing. I mean, bioethics itself, some would say, would be a watered down version of moral philosophy. And so what? Every theoretical framework is a watered down version of something that occurred in the past. And that's fine. So it always goes back to, is this method going to help me answer my research question? And if you look at the elements of your research question, if it requires normative theorizing, maybe a purely theoretical bioethics approach will be sufficient. But if you, again, inspect the research question and it requires some form of engaging with the world, engaging with I guess, broadly understood facts of the world, then maybe an empirical methodology would be useful. So I think it's still an ongoing process for me in terms of trying to be comfortable with my academic identity and who I am. But I know that when I have to apply for research funding, then I do have to specify. And that's where the performativity of identity really enters the picture. But in terms of how you presented, Mikey, the different kinds of thin and thick descriptions or approaches to the mixture of the empirical and the normative, I really appreciated that, because one of the things that my friends who are philosophers, whenever we attend bioethics talks or conferences, is that often we feel that actually a lot of the bioethics talks lack normative theorizing. And no offense to my colleagues from medicine. So a lot of times they will present, for example, a case history. And it will always end up like they just had a moral distress. And moral distress is important. We can examine and unpack moral distress. But where is the normative theorizing based on that specific fact of the world that you encountered? So I think trying to identify and classify these approaches might be able to help people understand how to answer their own research question. So I really appreciate the effort. Thank you.
Thank you. This was like excellent way of question. I mean, starting with legitimacy and then going with the existential crisis of the identity and the bioethics conversation. And I'm curious to hear later the conversations from Mikey and John about this. Let's hear from Shun.
Thanks, Supriya. I'm really thrilled to be part of this panel because I'm so indebted to Mikey towards methodological innovation, which one of the papers we're talking about today, really opened up empirical bioethics for me and gave me a methodology for my PhD. I used grounded moral analysis. I'm going to take a slight step to the side and talk about some of the features of the empirical bioethics scene that came through in the papers and in the presentation indeed today, and that I believe need to develop in parallel with the growing clarity about the purpose and methods. And I'm going to offer some suggestions because unfortunately that's what I do. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was getting the empirical bit right. And Mike and John have emphasized this in the papers, but it remains that it's not sufficiently acknowledged and managed in practice. And I think it's largely because multidisciplinarity is very challenging. And while it's one of the strengths of the field, it is very rarely articulated in a way that sets out how it can be achieved. So I think further work needs to be done in that area because it's an important gap. And it relates a lot, as Miriam has said, to the training of researchers and the development of skills within their own disciplines, but also skills in working with other people and understanding the limitations, etc. So I feel that we're probably moving towards greater formality in the education of those who wish to engage in empirical bioethics or use those methods in projects. And certainly ideas around including formal qualifications or completion of formal programs in qualitative research or empirical bioethics methodologies would seem to be something that would appropriately be on the horizon. And it might be also important to think about how the division of labor within teams and the nature of training may affect the quality and intensity of debate about methods. Critique may not be prioritized because relatively junior people or students are engaged in the operational side of empirical bioethics, and they lack seniority and academic capital. Thinking about that, it might be that we need to work towards making products around describing or critiquing methods integral to completions of programs and major projects, etc., as part of the research output. The second point I wanted to talk about is related to the matter of quality, and it's around the ethics of doing empirical bioethics. So I'm prompted by these reflections about quality and the care that goes into defining and developing the field, to suggest that empirical bioethicists have a special responsibility to care about and act towards ensuring quality, transparency, and integrity in their research. Well, simply because it is bioethics, and that's what we should expect, but also because empirical bioethics is often undertaken in novel or provisional ways and by trainees and students or developing researchers, and because it's complex and internally contested. But mostly because of the current crisis in confidence in public confidence in research that's related to research integrity issues. So for empirical bioethics, this raises the importance of demonstrating the validity of methods used in studies. And perhaps there is a need to think about how the field should establish integrity concepts and standards that are applicable to qualitative and theoretical research in bioethics. So obviously Mikey's and John's work is hugely important in this regard, but we might also need to gain a greater understanding of the level of risk around research ethics and research integrity in the field in the immediate future.
Thank you so much, Sharon. This is like the conversation which keeps me bumping into the methodological rigor and the quality, which again connects back to the legitimacy, and which Eve was also talking. So we have a lot of interconnections here and overlapping concerns, but also questions. Now, John, would you take up and then, yeah?
This is coming through. Okay. Well, but thank you very much for letting me gate crash. Again, this wasn't really, I just happened to be passing at the time, so thanks for letting me join. I'm not prepared anything, but just try and pull on a couple of threads from the discussion so far, and then end, as I promised, by heckling Mikey just I guess the question about what empirical bioethics is and what it should be. I mean, my view is that at its best, empirical bioethics isn't about trying to change the way bioethics is done or trying to make a land grab or trying to possess anything. It's about grappling with the interdisciplinary and the interdisciplinarity that I think bioethics has always been, but not terribly well articulated. And I think in recent years, it's become rightly, I think, an attempt to explain what we're doing and explain how we are drawing on the various threads that we do to inform better ethical decision making. I guess briefly in response to something Kate said, I mean, I think all empirical bioethics is bioethics, but not all bioethics is empirical bioethics. And I think it's a mistake to, sorry, not your mistake, but it would be a mistake to think that the acceptance of empirical bioethics is saying that no other forms of bioethics are valid. I think that's to completely go against the idea that empirical bioethics is concerned with interdisciplinarity. And it's about, as Eve said, finding the right tools to answer the right questions. There's no such thing as the right method. There's only such thing as a more appropriate method for a particular kind of question. I think that's key. I guess when I started thinking about empirical bioethics, it was during my PhD, and I'd never given it any thought. And it was because the Wellcome Trust, who was funding my PhDs and Mikey's, just didn't fund anything purely conceptual. I was a philosopher. I was going to do philosophy. Excuse me. Suddenly, I had to learn how to do focus groups and collect empirical data. And then about 18 months in, I suddenly thought, shit, I've got to write a thesis. And I've got to somehow show how these things are together and make something vaguely coherent out of it. And I thought, well, what literature is out there? And my one of my supervisors pointed me towards Adam Hedgecoe's paper, Critical Bioethics, which told me everything that was wrong with philosophical bioethics. Didn't give me any indication about what to do next. So, and I think certainly the conversations Mike and I had with other people who were kind of in the same boat, being kind of thrown into this, was about, well, what would we need and what would we want? And I think a lot of the work we've tried to do is about trying to produce the kind of stuff that would have been useful to us as students. and I read recently a couple of books and papers. I thought, I wish I had access to this 20 years ago. So I do think none of this is solved. And I guess here's back to where I'm going to start to heckle Mikey briefly. I'll just take issue with two things. One is kind of whether empirical bioethics is established. I mean, I don't think you were saying it was. It's certainly a recognized approach, but I think it would be a mistake for anybody to think it's not still a work in progress. We're still working out how to do it. And I think if we ever stop reflecting on how best to do it, that would be a real problem, because the nature of bioethics changes. There's new challenges constantly. I think it will never be I can't imagine it ever being a methodologically static field. So it can risk navel gazing. I think that is a real risk, but we have to try to tread that line. And my final heckle to Mikey, because I will do, is just to take issue with and I think this is about the logic of presentation, which is necessary when talking about it. But I think the kind of 4-part justifications for the various thick methods of integration that were given, was it the metaethical, the political, the normative, and the metaphilosophical? I think lots of the examples given within each one they're not simply justified by one. There's lots of the approaches will appeal to lots of different kind of those justification, and I do think metaphilosophical collapses into metaethical, but that
Thank you, John. That was helpful to Hex. Mikey.
Yeah. I don't want to speak for too long because you've heard enough from me already, but thank you everybody for those amazing comments and for reading the papers and spending time thinking about the presentation in a much greater way than I have, I think, for many, many years. So thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think there was so much richness of the responses. It's very difficult to know what to cover. So I'll just pick out a couple of things as well. Firstly, I totally agree with you, John, on that last point. You know, we know this thing called empirical bioethics. It has a name. There are professors in it. People might say that's the kind of thing that you do. But I totally agree that we're on the sort of foothills of discovering what it is, how it all connects together, and what people are engaged in. And there's a sense in which this is a really important point for some of the reflections on quality and legitimacy, I think. We're all just, sort of discovering this sort of mountain, and we're climbing it from different angles, and we're finding our way through it. Don't quite know how high the mountain is or where we're going to end up. And there's a lot of open questions about where we're going to go and how far we're going to be able to get to the top together and share in some kind of novel way of doing the field, I think. So I completely agree with that. I think and that places real dangers for all of us, I think, but particularly for junior scholars who have to legitimate themselves directly in a particular way. I mean, bioethics perhaps is slightly easier than this because of the ways in which we're situated across disciplinary settings, but it's not a safe career choice to strive to become an empirical bioethicist. And I think people are right in commenting about how risky it is in trying to publish this work, because get the wrong reviewer and you will be just dismissed for reasons that have no legitimacy, it seems to me. I think we've all experienced that. So I think there's a lot of responsibility that comes with the work we're trying to do and the kind of idea about how we steer people through the development of quality standards. I mean, I do think we're not going to be able to say very much on those standards at the moment. And I think, we're going to have to sort of work with what we have and try our best to make it clear and that we're in a transparent and in integrity focused way as we can about how we're doing it. One of the things I think that follows from the multiple justifications, overlapping as they are, is that we can just be transparent and open about where we stand and allow our work to be assessed in accordance with those standards, as opposed to have to accept a defense of them each and every time somebody publishes something. Even if we might disagree with that fundamental starting point, we can't quibble with that, it seems to me, in every individual case. I'm really interested, I find it's a really powerful comment, Kate, that you made about the kind of potential risk of reinforcing status quos and the hand-wringing problem. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've been hand-wringing about this for many, many years. And I think the reason I've been doing that is because of a personal existential crisis about knowing where I fit, where I want to go in my own career, and to try to legitimize my own interests and my own inclinations, methodological inclinations. I'm I mean, for me, one of the concerns about the field of bioethics more generally is a risk about its coherency as a sort of field of inquiry. And, you know, we go to conferences and it's very difficult sometimes to not speak past people in the same room, working on the same topics. And I also wonder a bit about standards and how we maintain where those standards lie. So I think part of the reason why I'm interested in thinking about the field and its boundaries and its standards and its elements are in part just about thinking about giving an account of myself and others that I work with and align myself with, but not always knowing quite how and why and where we might go together. But maybe that's just the nature of the interdisciplinarity of the field. But I don't think that for me gives up the need to think carefully about it and its sort of integrity as a whole. I think your point about perhaps some of my accounts of bioethics as having a practicality element, but also this idea of being convincing and being convinced and us getting to co-production raised a really important objection. It's not visionary, you're right. It's very conservative because it essentially takes the world as we encounter it and says, let's try to make it better. Now that doesn't allow us to look into the future, potentially. It says, what are the problems that people are facing in practice now and how do we address them? So there's no forward-looking dimension to that. And I think that's right. That is a worry, I think, for what I was saying. But I think, suggest that, you know, that co-production idea, I think I have perhaps more faith in the practical ethical argumentation and its force than perhaps we'd allow for. So I would say that the resistance to just reinforcing established values or power dynamics and problematic commitments comes about through the ways in which we as researcher interrogate proactively, deliberate with and challenge those we are engaging with in practice. But if we're only working, as you're right to say, if we're only working with those practitioners, we do resist speaking in their voice, as it were, rather than speaking in the voice from behind the scenes and the voice of perhaps challenge or the voice of what's the phrase you used, a sort of alternative vision, I guess, for the moral outlook of that world. I think that also comes with some research ethics implications that somebody else mentioned. John and I are about to finish a paper on, which is about how we properly interrogate and deliberate with people who could otherwise face challenges.
Yeah. Thank you. There is a lot to unpack. So I'm trying to throw this question for the panel about here. There's an assumption and that they are descriptive and normative. There is this division, and then there's a conversation on in your papers. You talk about the integration. So the empirical bioethics, what it's supposed to be doing is the integration. But let's say this dichotomy doesn't exist, or from a certain epistemological framework, which one takes. How would you see the value of empirical bioethics research? I mean, that's something which I'm thinking through, but if there's a collapse of this dichotomy, then where the integration comes in, or should it come in, is what I had the con. Yeah, it's just there.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting question. I guess if you could actually show there was no difference between those kinds of work, be no point to empirical bioethics. I think that the reason it's come about is whoever practices them and however we draw those disciplinary lines. I can't see how a case could be made to say that they are fundamentally the same. I think they're fundamentally different practices. The descriptive and the normative. That's not to say they're not entangled. I've advocated strongly to say they are entangled. And the idea that they're kind of ontologically separate, if you like, but you can't make epistemic sense of either without them. And that's what we're doing. This is an activity in epistemology. It's about how we generate knowledge about what we ought to do. I've been very cowardly, I guess, and just glossed over the metaethical complexity by saying on one level it doesn't matter because we can't be required to solve the metaethical problems that many philosophers are concerned with before we start dealing with practical problems. So we can just assume we need to think about them both on an epistemic level and just ignore the stuff that metaethicists are concerned with. And I know that Mike can characterize my kind of approach as metaethical. I'm not sure it is, but it is premised on that assumption that it's kind of legitimate to just ignore it. And I guess that's a metaethical position. But so I'll stop in a minute. I think if you propose there is no distinction whatsoever I think there's no need for empirical bioethics. But that does raise an interesting question for certain people in the field who have suggested there's no fact value distinction whatsoever. And essentially, and if you accept that what they're proposing is not empirical bioethics, it's just doing ethics. I think that's an interesting challenge.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you, John. Now, Kate.
I'm a fact value distinction denialist. But I don't entirely, that doesn't mean that I actually really disagree with what you're saying, John, because to say that the fact value distinction is actually artificial, that this is a kind of philosophical device that has some limited usefulness, but isn't in fact true, isn't to say that there's not a difference between a descriptive project and a normative and a prescriptive project or a normative project. And it also doesn't deny that there are different kinds of facts. So there are psychological facts and economic facts and historical facts and moral facts. And all of those things are imbued with value, top to bottom. And so I think that it still makes sense to have different projects and to ask different questions and then to answer those questions in different appropriate ways. But then at the meta-ethical level, you're saying, but these are just different kinds of facts that we're dealing with, and they are entangled with value at every single level. So yeah, that's my take on it. And I guess that means that everybody's just always doing ethics as they should be.
Right, that's an interesting question to which we need to keep thinking through. But then I do know, like, we have still solid 45 minutes to keep having this conversation. If you have questions, just raise a hand just to make sure I keep the note. And then let's start with the question online. Erin is asking, my question is in relation to the justification of thick integration in bioethics. Are these backed up with theories? I see, for example, several approaches for the meta-ethical justification. Example, phenomenological and hermeneutic, etc. Would these, in principle, be underpinned by theories, phenomenology for the phenomenological justification? Anyone wants to respond? Engage, Michael Dunn?
Thanks, Irene.
Yeah, you're on.
On? Okay. Thanks, Irene. That's a great question. Yes, absolutely. I think that's right. I think the justifications lie in a particular theoretical commitment. I'll give you an example. Good colleague of mine in Amsterdam, Guy Widdeschoven, is a hermeneutic philosopher who articulates an empirical bioethics method consistent with that hermeneutic philosopher. He calls it pragmatic hermeneutics, I think. And there's a clearly developed methodological approach out of that. I think John's right, he's doing ethics rather than doing empirical ethics. Not that I don't think much hinges on that, but he would say, yes, it's really important that we reason with people in dialogue to find out, to fuse our horizons, come up with some moral truths together, and engage in this hermeneutic project of dialogical interpretation and understanding. And that is true to the philosophical commitments as practiced around a practical ethical problem in the world. So you can very much track those back to the meta-ethical theoretical positions that are in the background. As John said, I think we have to find a way to perhaps not necessarily track that back in assessing the quality of those works, but they do seem to be in play.
Yeah, thank you. So we have in room question 3.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Sounds the same to me. It's one for Mikey and Kate, really. So, Kate, I was quite shocked, confronted to hear you say this sounds like shitty co-design. Because this has got nothing to do with co-design, and I guess in a way I'm trying to correct the record. Co-design has a very specific meaning that's used in a very specific context, and it's not normative. It can be normative if you then do the work to make it so. But then, Mikey, you were talking about co-production, and I would love to hear more, I guess, about what you meant by that and where that comes about. And I guess the reason I'm asking this question is that when we talk about quality and bioethics, I think it's empirical bioethics, rather, I think it's so important to be really, really clear and careful methodologically. And it's something that is difficult to do and important to try and defend, I suppose.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mean, I don't want to carry with it any presumptions around how those terms are used elsewhere. I'm talking particularly here about the idea of co-producing a practical ethical argument with an interlocutor in some empirical context.
Right.
So I think over time, I've increasingly taken the view that it's really, really hard to integrate the empirical and the ethical, to take facts about the world collected through interviews and focus groups and try to go back to the armchair or to the analytic table and start to integrate them with arguments and such like. So I think there's a lot more potential in the work that we can do to take the arguments into the field, as it were, to say, look, these arguments, because we're trying to produce practical or claims that are both practical and justifiable, you know, we should work with those who stand in relationship to these arguments in the world, and we should construct them together. And that simply means, I guess, deliberating proactively with people in the world, you know, over an iterative process, challenging actively and interrogating their views, having your own views as the researcher challenged and interrogated in just the same way. And the idea is that over time, you'll come through a consultative or dialogical process to agree a set of conclusions that are both practical and justifiable.
Yeah, sure. And I think that sounds like a good example of it. So what I was saying, Jane, not to claim that all is shitty co-design. Rather, one of the risks of empirical bioethics is that it ends up committing those shitty behaviors that you see in other kinds of empirical work, where instead of being properly engaged with community, there is a kind of chauvinism that comes in and says, maybe there are value commitments already there in the background. And you come in and sort of say what the problem is rather than discovering what the problem is. And, you know, we had a few weeks ago, we had a great talk in the Miles Little lecture from Marie Toombs about how to do really good in community work. I think that one of the risks, and that's really all I'm saying about this, of empirical bioethics, is that sometimes maybe you get philosophers who really don't know what they're doing, coming in and trying to do empirical bioethics, empirical methods without the proper training. I think all empirical work can commit these same kinds of problems. It requires the kind of thoughtfulness that Michael was just talking about. So it's not a kind of exclusive thing, but I think that when we're doing ethics, I guess this is where my worries about chauvinism and relativism connect. I do think we have to say things about how the world ought to be. That means that sometimes we have to disagree with how it is, and sometimes we have to disagree strongly with how other people think it should be out in the world. And when we find out from them that they think very strongly that this is how the world should be, we have to like plant our feet and say, no, and you're wrong. And that actually means that, well, it certainly complicates the picture of doing the kind of co-production of moral knowledge that you're talking about. It's where the vision comes in and says, actually, this is revision. You can't sort of just accept this. So it's sort of, I think, one of the kind of tensions kind of inherent in empirical bioethics is that you're not merely reporting on the world, you're actually seeking to change it, as all ethics is. So.
Great. Thank you, Kate. I mean, it's an interesting question. With co-design, it's just one methodology,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I guess.
So there are so many ways, even within qualitative research, there are thousands of ways when researchers do it. And that's where the question of reflexivity comes again and again, I think, within the conversations. But we have a question, and also I think, okay, let me just read out the question, and then we have Pujit and then Bridget. So let's start with, okay, so I'm going to read out the question here posed. Thank you all for your different contributions to the subject. For the panelists who have actually engaged in projects that fall under the rubric of empirical bioethics, could you please share the approach you privilege over the other and why? Would anyone suggest that the reflective equilibrium approach is better or easier for new entrants into the empirical bioethics than the dialogical deliberative approach? Oh my goodness, there are so many unpacking questions there. Who would want to answer?
I know how long have we got? There's a very, very long answer to that. The short answer is it depends entirely what you're trying to do. So there's no such thing as a good method or a bad method. It's like asking if it's better to use a fork or a spoon or chopsticks. And before you know what it is you've got to try to eat. So I think that it also depends on what you're trying to produce, not just a question, but are you trying to do something where you really own the conclusions and it's your work, in which case you might want a more consultative method, of which reflective equilibrium is a good starting point. Or do you want to do something that involves dialogue and you're producing something with other people, which, you know, if done badly, can resemble shitty co-design, but if done well and with the right question, it can be a very effective way of generating solutions to a specific problem. So I think the question in general is very, very difficult to answer. Yeah, that's about as much as I can say, but I think if it's a real problem, try to have a one-to-one conversation or drop somebody an email with the specifics, and I think that'll be far more useful.
Great, thanks, John. Bridget, sorry, Hojat, and then we'll get back. Koji?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks to you, Priya, thanks, Mikey, and thanks the panelists. I have one observation and then I ask a question. So my observation is in relation to what Eve mentioned, of what he is seeing in the bioethics conferences. I think, so my observation is not that people do not make normative claims. My observation is that many people do not engage in robust argumentation. And I think, so that's the observation. The question part of the question part is this. I think to some extent, the discussion shouldn't be about whether or not we want to integrate normative into empirical. Because I think many empirical findings or empirical research that I read make normative comments. I think the question for me, and I want to see what Mikey thinks about this, is whether or not that's argumentatively robust enough. And I think in many cases it's not. So for me, the question is about making robust normative arguments and engage in robust argumentative practices, rather than asking for integration of normative dimensions to empirical research. Thank you. I hope that it makes sense.
Thanks, Tony. That's a great point. I mean, I broadly agree with you. I share that worry, I think. I mean, you know, any claim we make is only as good as the argument that underpins it and how robust and justifiable that argument is. And I don't mean that in relationship to ethical arguments. I think it's true of all arguments. So somebody makes an empirical claim, you know, the quality of the empirical argument that underpins it needs to be robust. And I think you're right that in bioethics, one of the concerns with standards, I think, is that normative claims are everywhere, but good arguments are less likely to be seen in the papers that we review. You know, assertions around normative positions is not uncommon, and you know, some of those seem to me to be problematic in the ways in which they are presented. So I agree with you that much of what's guiding my thinking about empirical bioethics and any kind of work in bioethics is the quality of the argumentation that drives whatever we are seeking to do, the questions we're seeking to answer. But I don't just think it's about argumentation understood in this sort of sense of robustness. I also think, just as importantly, our arguments have to be practical in the right kind of way. I think it's absolutely right to say that we fail in our argumentative strategy in bioethics if we make wonderfully robust, sophisticated arguments that nobody are interested in implementing in practice. I think that's a failure of argumentation in our field. And that is for me marks out the difference between bioethics and, let's say, applied philosophy, where I don't think we want to make that same distinction. So yes, I agree with you, but I also don't think that's the only standard we should hold the quality of our arguments to in the work that we do. And that's why I do think empirical bioethics has a future, because I think it's best placed to get at that practicality kind of consideration.
If you have a response,
Just to add, Hoji, thanks for the question. But I also want to remind people that when we talk about robustness, that we are appealing to specific values and norms in specific disciplines. Robustness in philosophy is different when it comes to robustness of arguments in social sciences. Just to say that. The second point is that there are practical barriers in what you might think would be non-robust arguments when it comes to publications. Especially if we're talking about empirical bioethics, where a lot, probably 80% of the space will be devoted to findings, summary of the findings, and then discussion of the findings. And discussion of the findings is such a tiny portion And that's probably the only part where you can make normative analysis. So I'm just saying that there's not a lot of journals will allow for 10,000 word articles. So yes, so just to say that it's not necessarily because people don't want to have more, when we say robust, probably longer argumentation on the normative part. There are practical barriers. Thank you.
Thank you for flagging that. I think even I was thinking as the questions were unpacking about, but at the same time, the robustness, right? The idea of each qualitative researchers have a different set of normativity which they adhere to, but then which not necessarily always acknowledged from the philosopher's point of view. So there's a high theory and a low theory, the way this distinction is coming up. But anyway, Bridget and then Ainsley.
My point was just a very quick add to Eve's though. Is that okay,
Yes.
Bridget? Sure. I was just going to say, I think there are a couple of journals that do that really well. So AJOB Empirical Bioethics, for example, we had a great experience with them, giving them a 10,000 word paper that very much iterated from start to finish, empirical and normative. Had a recent experience. Some of the people are co-authors on the paper. It's now published. And it's in bioethics. And we put in a table of empirical findings in a largely normative paper. And after, the peer review process as it does, that table is gone. And so we actually ended up having to become more normative because we couldn't appease an empirically based reviewer. And I think part of that might have been that at the time we submitted other papers from the same project that had empirical findings weren't yet published. So we didn't really have a methodology that we could cite. Anyway, they are now published. So we were like, take that at proof stage, we put that paper in. But anyway, Shun is smiling because she is a co-author and remembers this well. But it's quite interesting how it plays out because it's another barrier, to methodology is appeasing our editors and our peer reviewers. Anyway, sorry, Bridget, to jump in on that point.
Thank you.
Just click it up.
Okay, it is on.
No.
Thank you. Look, I just wanted to make a quick observation. One of the things that I noticed was earlier on, I think particularly you, Kate, at one stage were talking about the empirical stuff as being facts, which not necessarily. And I guess I wanted to talk about the idea of empirical bioethics as part of it, as part of the sort of empirical stuff of it, as being an exploration of what is the good, and not really in a relativist sense, but when your issue is, say, for example, how should a gay male sex culture be? I can't work that out by myself. I can't sit in my ivory tower. I do not have those skills. I don't have that experience. And so a lot of the actual empirical work is that discussion with people about what the good is and also what the possible is and what the constraints are. And I feel like what can be missing from philosophical ethics, if I think back to my research ethics days and incredibly firm views that I had from a normative perspective when, turn myself off. Maybe it's a sign. Anyway. No, it's back on. Okay, no, it just moves, I see. That some of your kind of grand normative ideas can actually be just impossible.
Yeah.
And you don't know those things unless you talk to people. And so I suppose there's a humility about empirical bioethics to me, which is about actually not necessarily knowing what the good is or what the possible is and wanting your normative conclusion to be something real that it may not otherwise be able to be.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. I mean, I totally agree. That's what feminist bioethics does, and that's what disability bioethics does too. And then I'm like, well, so how is it different from empirical bioethics? So what is empirical bioethics? And maybe it's all the things, like, I don't know. John.
After some conversations with Jackie Leach Scully in that chapter she wrote in the Cambridge University Press book, I mean, it gave me wondering whether all empirical bioethics or good empirical bioethics is actually feminist. Not all feminist bioethics is empirical bioethics, but doing it properly, because what it's motivated by is that sense of humility. Certainly one of the things that motivated me to get involved with it was this frustration with applied philosophy that I was reading at the time, that just played fast and loose with assumptions that everyone else thinks the way that I do, and premising arguments on assumptions about what's reasonable and what they would think and what we would all be willing to accept. Just thought, well, that's ridiculous. So yeah, I mean, I guess to agree with you.
If I can quickly say one other thing is that in my early days of doing my PhD, I read someone else's PhD, which was all about a very, very detailed critique of how a trial was conducted, except I knew that that trial was never conducted that way. That before, and so the PhD went on and was published and had all about something that didn't happen because it was actually changed probably about 6 months after the person first saw the concept, and it made me worried for the field.
Yeah. There is another question online. How much does or should the projected audience factor into choice of methodology early on in empirical bioethics? Or should audience not be factored in until much later on? Anyone wants to?
Is this for a thesis?
No, I think this is
Sarah?
an actual project.
It's Sarah.
Like the audience
Sarah.
empirical study, right?
Sarah's question. Anyone wants to?
Sarah, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I guess I was taken by Eve's comments about earlier, like in his first reflection about choosing the methodology according to the question that you're asking, which I understand. But I guess, yeah, in terms of like the practical sort of element and wanting your audience to understand the output, and perhaps thinking about different audiences and how they may or may not understand or what they may or may not deem credible. I'm just wondering how much should the audience be sort of thought about very early on in the choice of methodology, in terms of what you anticipate, who you anticipate to be speaking to, or should that be ignored until sort of much later on at the point where I guess you are aiming, you are trying to interact with the audience with your output, and if you happen to have chosen perhaps a methodology that is not as well understood by the particular audience, is there a further, I feel hesitant to say the word translation, but is there an additional sort of step to I guess to assist your audience to understand?
So I guess for me, in a practical sense, it really depends on the project. For example, is it a thesis project or is it an article that you're wanting to produce? And the concept of audience is quite diverse because you have reviewers, peer reviewers, you have assessors if it's a funding application, and you have the general public who might be general consumers of knowledge. And then you have stakeholders, policymakers, in the context of bioethics, perhaps clinicians or healthcare workers. So there are different ways of describing methodology based on the audience. And I would say that let's not take for granted the ability of audience to understand new knowledge and new methodology. It's just the way you describe. So at the end of the day, if it's an empirical methodology, the general sense is that you got information or you tried to find out information in this specific way. And the details of that approach will depend on whether you're talking to academic audience or general public. So for me, it's not so much as considering the audience and then deciding what methodology you're about to do in the project you're about to start. It's more of deal with the research question, what is the appropriate methodology for that research question, and then have faith in yourself that you can modify how you talk about the methodology depending on the audience.
John?
Yeah.
And then,
I don't disagree with anything that Eve's said. And my first response was to a question, Sarah, was to say, not at all, because don't let the tail wag the dog. Don't let your audience determine your methodology. Your methodology does need to be determined by what you're trying to do in your research questions. But I don't think that means you shouldn't or can't be attentive to thinking at the start about what the routes for dissemination are. Certainly, if you're applying for funding, you've got to think about a dissemination strategy. You've got to say who your target audiences are. I think if at that conception point you cannot imagine how you might communicate this, I think that might show you might need to think again about the proposal. So I think it's worth thinking about it, but I don't think you should let restrictions on communicating results determine your methodology, but it might be about the way you're framing the question.
Thank you, James. I'm unable to, I have to say this, I feel now with this conversation is like coming from Global South or having lived all my life in India and then trying to work my way up, let's say, if I want to put it within the bioethics field or thinking through still, I feel we are responding the publications or the gaming the system, bioethics or empirical bioethics conversations. I feel like as a scholar who is positioned in Global South are thinking through, I'm constantly pleasing the scholars in Global North to make my case. And then the literature which I pick and engage is constantly again pleasing. Because I remember in the beginning of my PhD, when I was writing my analysis from the point of Global South literature, not one bioethics journals engaged saying this is not bioethics, literally said. The reason why I'm bringing out this conversation is the field in itself is so much territorial, which in a way, which you mentioned in one of your paper, and then just putting out there to think through what are we trying to achieve when we think of methodological rigor and how do we engage and how do we bridge this kind of global North and South divide, if I want to put it out. Yeah.
Well, just a quick point on this. I mean, I do think the entry criteria for empirical bioethics are quite high. You have to have a pretty robust sense about knowing what it means to think about normative work and empirical work. I think there's a whole range of sort of failures in the domain of training and communication across borders that we haven't really even got to grips with yet. Hopefully that our ABLE group will do some good work on that.
Right, and quickly to respond to that, I think it's like, what is a legitimate knowledge? Where and when is something which also we need to keep wrestling with, I think we need to. But we have a question. Irene, please. Irene?
Yeah, one of my questions seems to have been missed from up there, but I wanted to just ask, even as we discuss empirical bioethics, I'm seeing how much in the literature bioethics, empirical bioethics authors are struggling with systematic reviews. And so my question will be, what is the place of systematic reviews in empirical bioethics in your view as panelists? Because a lot of the empirical bioethics research is social science work, and a lot of it will definitely be qualitative work. And so that would mean if somebody was to do a review, they'll be doing a review of qualitative work and qualitative articles out there that have employed qualitative methodologies. And so I don't know what you think about the value of the relevance of systematic reviews in the empirical bioethics field. Thank you.
Could I speak to this, as I've written about it recently? Yeah. I think it's a really interesting question. I think my standard refrain today is becoming, it depends what you're trying to do. I think that systematic reviews can serve a really, really useful function in assimilating information, in aggregating what we know, in just making sure we're not reinventing the wheel. I think they serve a very different function in health research than they do in bioethics and empirical research. And I think the language of systematic review is problematic. And this is what I've written on recently with a colleague, because it implies certain processes and certain features that can be misread, and non-expert consumers of systematic views in bioethics can make assumptions about what it's showing, what it's doing, if they're assuming it's like health research. So I think if we're talking about robust literature review, I think that's really, really important. I think the days of simply snowballing and reading stuff that interests you, which is what I did when I was doing my PhD. Luckily, I had a supervisor who, when I sat down, she just presented me with a kind of mountain of papers and said, "You do nothing until you've read all of those." That was, I thought she was horrible at the time, but it was a good experience. I think the days of that are probably gone. Systematic review and identifying papers is getting easier. There's so much more out there. But I think we have to be careful with systematic review. We have to be careful we're doing it for the right reasons and be sure we're doing the right thing with them.
Right. Many of the systematic reviews come with like one truth argument, like the output is, but then how do we understand and unpack within values? I mean, any.
Yeah, I guess the classic papers by Daniel Streck and Nima Safir years ago, 2012 or something, where they were suggesting we do systematic reviews of reasons. And what they suggested was we can use the methods of systematic review to identify and present in a neutral way the arguments that are there for the consumer to just use. And the aim was that this would be a good way of presenting a range of ethical arguments to policymakers and government, for example. One of the problems with this is if you're a policymaker in government used to systematic review, what you're expecting is aggregation and presentation of this is the common thread, so this is the right one. And there's a problem with quality appraisal and systematic review. Standardly, that method implies that you are doing quality appraisal going in. That makes no sense in my view when you're doing literature reviews of bioethics, because a bad argument can be just as informative. You want to present it, you want to present it fairly and then explain why it's wrong. You don't want to exclude it from consideration.
Yeah, true. There's a lot to unpack there with the questions of systematic and scoping reviews also a lot of. Now we have. Ainsley.
Oh, I was just going to build on that actually, and what I was going to mention is scoping reviews, because I feel like things, and also a methodology that's a development on, I think it's critical interpretive synthesis, but it's Ros McDougall's paper on how they might play out in bioethics. And I actually think those ways of thinking and putting together literature are probably more helpful for bioethics than systematic reviews for all the reasons you mentioned. And then the other tangent that you got me thinking about, and there's a very small literature about this, which is, how do you evaluate bioethics? Mel Jansen has done a paper, and Bjorn Hoffman has also written in this sense of analysis of a so-called exemplary article. And, you may disagree on whether the article chosen was exemplary, but it also pushes us to reflect on, quality indicators in our methodology, even if that makes sense as a thing to say, which it may or may not, depending on where you come from. And I think all of these aren't front and center when we think about empirical bioethics, but I think they are relevant considerations to have in the background. How do we amass prior knowledge? How do we evaluate that prior knowledge? How do we compare it, etc.?
Just to quickly follow up on that, I think at the same time, the number of scoping reviews and systematic reviews have increased. And I feel it's because of the current academic system, which is neoliberal values, which is holding on. The number of funding and the number of citations, I think that's something we need to question and think through. Please.
It's a slight change. It's a pivot of topic. Is that okay?
I feel like let's fix academia.
Well, this comment pivots toward actually something that Mikey said earlier, which was about argument failure. Because I think that was in one of the papers, and then you reiterated it here in the discussion about how we want our arguments to convince. And I guess that we know it's convinced when we see things changing in the world somehow. And I actually was struck by that and unsure if that's the right way to measure the success of an argument, because there's a paper, one of Peter Singer's papers, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, which I teach to our students. And it's a beautiful argument. It's a very difficult argument to object to. It begins with a premise that is almost unobjectionable, which is that death and suffering by hunger is bad. So that's P1. And then we kind of see what follows if you agree that death and suffering and starvation is bad. So I guess I bring this up only because I teach this every year, and the argument is watertight. And at the end of it, I'm like, so how many in this very affluent classroom of people who are masters of bioethics students are now going to be contributing 10% or more of their income to famine relief or other poverty measures? And the hands are tucked in pockets. It's like, well, I agree with the argument, or the argument is great, and I am convinced he's right. And then we hit the lack of moral motivation. And moral motivation is actually a separate thing. It's a moral psychological phenomenon. So I guess I'm sort of thinking about, success and failure in bioethics. This is a great argument. It's not a bad argument at all. It's a great argument. it still hits the wall of moral motivation. So I was thinking just about that when you're making the claims about, you know, how do we evaluate bioethics? I don't actually know if it is that way, but I don't know how else to do it.
Can I take that question just one step further? Sarah had asked a question earlier about audience. And I was thinking about your earlier comments about being convincing and convinced. And so when the answer to that question came, and the answer was that don't worry about the audience, worry about other things. I was wondering to myself, when do you decide that you want to be convincing? Like, when do you decide whom you want to convince? Because if you decided that, then you are caring deeply about the audience.
Yeah, these are great questions. I mean, I do think that practicality criterion and then the being convinced stuff is the most controversial part of this. I mean, my starting point for thinking about that was less about the moral psychological kind of weakness of will worries. It's more about how, you know, in the real world of practices that most of us work on, and I'm thinking here about sort of, you know, the sort of research ethics, clinical ethics type scenarios. We work in real life, politically charged, practically constrained environments where the most wonderfully exciting, convincing thought experiment simply won't resonate to those who are caught up in the kind of everyday realities and you know, problems that we face, right? And so people will often say something like, you know, but that's not implementable, or, you know, I buy your argument, but I simply can't work with it in this context because of these political reasons. It seems like we want our arguments, if we're motivated by the idea of saying, look, there's a practical ethical problem that a group of people are facing in the real world, it's not simply enough to say, we've got an argument that could solve it in an ideal world. We've got to be able to solve it in the real world. I mean the real world here in the sort of mess of practical and political constraint within which people have to enact claims. Now, I do agree with you that the kind of problems of being convinced when we are kind of weak of will or we are not psychologically strong enough morally to kind of deal with that are much harder situations to address. But and whether I want to say that Peter Singer's argument fails as an argument because of that failure to connect with the kind of psychological commitment of those people is a much more tenuous view. I think that's right. But something to that, I think we'll think a bit more about that. But yeah, I guess I'm more driven by the kind of practical and political constraints that we might find in kind of ought and can relationships.
That's turned off. Okay.
I guess there is an interesting question there, though, still about how you evaluate success. I mean, I guess I've always understood this distinction that you're making between being capable of convincing and convincing in much the way that I think about when I'm marking essays, for example, or reviewing papers. I think the aim is not that they have to convince me, because they just might not and never. And that's not what we're expecting people to do. We're expecting them to present arguments that, I guess, to use your language, they kind of form well when we think of, you know, the general, I've completely forgotten the language that you use, which is appalling, really. The standards of argumentation. It's a wonderful.
And it's 5 o'clock on a Friday, Neil.
Yeah. Universal standards of argumentation, right? And that's what we're looking for. I mean, so I'd always assume that was what you meant, and because I guess when you start to put other contextual stuff and are capable of convincing in this the context and political realm, I mean, that seems to complicate it even more. So are you kind of demanding too much?
Okay. I mean, yeah, maybe. I mean, I just think that that this practicality requirement is of equivalent importance to the universal justificatory standard as well. So I just take it to mean that if I make an argument that, you know, I think is as convincing as possible and meets those standards of justification, and it fails to move you, my argumentative strategy has failed. If my aim is to make you change your practice in a certain kind of way, I think I failed in my activity. And simply saying, but it's the best, but it's a fantastic argument doesn't go far enough. But of course, then the question is, and this is one of the objections I was going to state. You know, it sounds like we then just turned our kind of justificatory strategies into marketing. Right? We're going to market our arguments and convince people as best we can. There was a question about how we navigate that convinced boundary.
Great. So if we do we have any last questions? Okay, I know it's a Friday afternoon. So thank you so much for being here on this Friday afternoon, and especially for Mikey and John to be here together, and all the panelists. Right. Thank you, Miriam, Shun, Sarah, Eve, and everyone here for this amazing conversations. And I think we need to keep continuing these conversations. And I hope this hour we have an empirical ethics stream which would allow us to keep continuing this methodological conversations which we are having here. So thanks again for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I broke down, yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Sarah.
Fantastic photo backdrop as well. Okay.
Thank you, Fran.
Yeah.
Thank you.